Does habitual caffeine consumption impact the ergogenic effects of caffeine? Welcome to the Science of Getting Faster podcast, where we cut through the headlines and talk directly to the researchers to find out what their studies suggest, what they don't, and where their research is heading. My name is Sarah Laverty, and on the podcast with us today we have Dr. Bryan Saunders. Welcome to the podcast, Bryan.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. Thanks for coming on. Could you start by telling us your story?
My story, you mean sort of how I got here, how I got to the moment I'm at?
Yeah.
Sure. So I was born and raised in Belgium, ended up going to the UK for my undergraduates, where I started sports science and mathematics, started sort of diving further and further into sports science for a master's. Went to Nottingham-Trent University for a PhD under the supervision of Caroline Sunderland and Craig Sale. And that's where I started working with the effects of ergogenic supplements on exercise performance. So kind of looking at the physiology behind them, why they work, how they work, which kind of exercises benefit most. And then, through a bit of luck at a conference, I met some Brazilians who were keen to internationalize their department. I was coming to the end of my PhD. We applied for some funding for me to come over to Brazil. And hey ho, sort of the following year, 2012, I came out to Brazil to do a postdoc and to kind of continue that research line of supplements and exercise performance. And so I've been here for the last 10 years. I've been able to, develop my research line a little bit, expand out a little bit more, touching on lots of different supplements, their effects on the body, their effects on exercise performance, and sort of caffeine is one of those. So that's kind of my story, very as quick as I could.
Yeah. Were you an athlete yourself? Is that how you got into sports science?
I don't think I would dare to call myself that. I enjoy doing sport. I've always played football. I've enjoyed cycling a lot, but always to kind of a recreational level. So, sometimes I might be good enough to participate in some of my own studies, but not always.
That's a very British thing to underplay your own athleticism. So we're talking about caffeine and whether habitually consuming it impacts the ergogenic effects. Historically, how has caffeine been used as a performance-enhancing agent?
So historically, caffeine's been around in sports for a long time. If you look at sort of the Tour de France, actually, there's sort of videos of in the early 1900s of these cyclists jumping off their bikes, running into cafes, downing a few espressos, alongside a fair few other sort of products that would definitely be banned today. And since then, it's kind of gone from strength to strength, really. That being said, it was kind of sort of banned in competition for a while. There was sort of a threshold amount in urine above which you would test positive. So that was about 12 micrograms per milliliter, but it's actually kind of is quite a lot of caffeine. And back in 2004, caffeine was actually taken back off this anti-doping list. So, the last few years, certainly research has really grown. And from my experience, its use in competition and training has really grown as well.
If we were to quantify that in terms of cups of coffee, how much would we have to drink to get to that limit?
It's quite a high limit.
Okay.
So it's quite difficult to define in one way because there's so much variation in the quantity of caffeine that you get in your cup of coffee. The source of the coffee, the way you prepare it, and even the day to day. You could put your 3 or 4 scoops in, but one day to the next, there'll still be a different amount of caffeine in your cup of coffee. That being said, you could probably say something along the lines of maybe 6 to 8 cups of coffee, potentially more. There's studies that have shown that if you actually provide the caffeine, around 5 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body mass, which is quite a fairly reasonable dose, wouldn't get you to that limit. So yeah, the threshold's quite high, potentially variable, but you're probably around 6 to 8 cups of coffee, so quite a lot.
Is coffee how most athletes consume caffeine, or what are the different ways that you generally see athletes consuming caffeine?
Coffee is definitely one of them. The only issue that I would say with taking caffeine via coffee is, again, that variation. You don't know exactly how much you're getting. And so you might not be getting the dose that you want to kind of improve your subsequent performance. But, there's so many different kinds of forms out there through which you could take them. You could take them in just capsules, in powder, in energy drinks. You've got chewing gum these days, energy gels, bars. They're even in pre-workout supplements. So, there's so many different ways of doing it. My preferred way, and what I usually suggest to people, is if you take it in capsule form, you buy a 200 milligram capsule or 250 milligram capsule, you know exactly how much you're getting. Whereas in some of the other forms, maybe it might be a bit more variable, so you don't quite know how much is in there.
Right. And how then, physiologically, how does caffeine improve performance, or how is it speculated to improve performance?
So that's a question that I think research has been trying to get to the bottom of for the last 50 odd years probably now. One of the initial mechanisms sort of that people suggested was that it could increase fat burning. That's due to sort of an increase in adrenaline that is produced due to the ingested caffeine. This sort of increased sort of oxidation of fats would then spare your muscle glycogen, and then you could sort of perform exercise for longer. What we do see during exercise, increased fat oxidation commonly occur in lots of different studies. But I think sort of overall over the last 20 years, that theory's maybe sort of been drowned out a little bit. There's that mechanism can't explain, for example, how kind of short duration, high intensity exercise is improved with caffeine. So right. If it isn't, a mechanism, it's definitely not the only one.
And then, so assuming that caffeine, at least from an anecdotal perspective, it feels like you can run, like your adrenaline is going, so it's like you're in fight or flight to run faster. And assuming then that the intensity is increasing, would that then offset the effects of increased fat burning if you're increasing the intensity due to that adrenaline rush? Because assuming that the exercise intensity is modulating what substrate we're using.
It's a good point, I guess. Again, that's more relevant for the shorter duration, high intensity exercise when you're looking at the really endurance stuff. We might see a slight increase in power output, slight increase in intensity, but you're probably not jumping from 75% of your maximum to 90% of your maximum either. All supplements generally have a fairly moderate effect on these outcomes.
Okay.
But then just touching on that, I think that's an important point about sort of. No, sorry, I'll maybe cut that out and I'll let you sort of jump back to a question.
Yeah, no worries. So, does it have then an impact on our central nervous system? Is there theories behind that?
Yeah, so that's the primary mechanism by which we believe that caffeine works. So via the antagonism of adenosine receptors within the central nervous system. And so these adenosine receptors, they're responsible for motor function, the reward systems, behavior, and they work in collaboration with the dopamine receptors, so sort of the reward center. So the chemical structure of caffeine is similar to adenosine, so that allows it to bind to these receptors. And now, usually when adenosine binds, what we see is a reduction in kind of behavioral activation, volition. High concentrations of adenosine are related to sleep. So if this binding is then inhibited, what we have is a higher activation also of the dopamine receptors. We see increase of dopamine, norepinephrine, or adrenaline, noradrenaline. We see an increase in central motor drive, reduced perception of effort during exercise, and also this can even sort of peripherally alter sort of the muscular response. So, via sort of a number of different mechanisms, even sort of pain mechanisms as well, we see a reduced perception of pain during exercise as well. So all these kind of bind together to what we think is lead to the improvements in exercise performance.
So all of those that you were saying, RPE, would it be mood that if it's affecting the dopamine, would it be your mood improves?
It can, yes.
Could. And then assuming that if it's on the central nervous system, alertness and attention, that's how it's speculated then to
exactly
improve performance. So it's like adenosine is what might cause you to become tired throughout the day, and it's like caffeine's blocking that. Is that?
Exactly. It has a kind of depressive influence on the adrenaline and noradrenaline release from our adrenal glands. So, if we inhibit this, we see a greater production of these catecholamines, and we see, positive effects on mood, positive effects on vigilance, focus, alertness, all these kinds of things, which can aid in exercise performance, obviously.
Right. Wow. So it's quite far-reaching, the potential effects of caffeine.
Yeah, I think so, and I think from my point of view, I think that's why caffeine seems to have quite a wide reach in terms of different exercise types. It's, some supplements might only work particularly in one kind of exercise type, whereas caffeine seems to work for, very explosive, short-term high intensity exercise, longer duration aerobic. So caffeine seems to be able to do it all.
Wow. Okay. So what was the question then that you were trying to answer in this paper? Can you remind us?
So one of the things that's come sort of to my attention, but also to the attention of a lot of researchers recently, is that across a lot of caffeine studies, there does seem to be some variability in the response to supplementation. What we see is generally up to as much as kind of 35% of people don't seem to respond or respond to a lesser extent. And I guess the question is why? And so there's a lot of potential theories why. Genetics is one of them. But certainly more recently, interest has gained traction in the importance of habitual caffeine consumption on this response. So many people suggest that habitual caffeine consumption may generate a tolerance to its effects. So then this will reduce its potential benefits. And so that's why some people might not have a benefit, because they are caffeine consumers on a daily basis. And so because they've built up a tolerance over time, then they get a benefit when supplementing it prior to an exercise bout. And, I don't think we have any black or white answers about that right now. And so that sort of piqued our interest, and that's why we started going down this rabbit hole.
Okay, so mechanistically then, how would you build up a tolerance to caffeine? How would that work?
I suppose, like any drug, which caffeine typically is, repeat administration so leads to a diminished response. The tolerance could be because metabolism of the drug speeds up, So, you get rid of it quicker. And there are some data suggesting that caffeine metabolism is increased following prolonged or chronic ingestion. And another way is because of the number of binding sites generally reduces. But actually, there's some studies in mice, in rodent models, showing that high dose chronic caffeine consumption actually increases the number of brain adenosine receptors. Obviously, caveat, it's in mice, it's not in humans. It's a bit difficult to replicate in humans. I don't see many people. It's difficult enough to get muscle biopsies. To get brain biopsies would be a whole other kettle of fish. But if we extrapolate, if that response is the same in humans, what this may mean is then that the amount of caffeine required to sort of generate a similar response is higher, due to sort of lower antagonism of those receptors. You've got more of them, so you need more to antagonize more. But I guess, a more honest answer would be, I guess we're not really sure mechanistically, and it's all kind of speculation for now, really.
Yeah. What was your hypothesis before the study?
So despite, we done a bit of research on the topic before forming this meta-analysis. And despite, people, I think anecdotal evidence of, oh yeah, I don't feel the effects of caffeine anymore. You always hear people say these kinds of things. Despite that, I wasn't too convinced that it had an effect, because I've used caffeine myself and seen an effect, and I think I take fairly large amounts per day. But obviously, an NF1 in uncontrolled conditions isn't the greatest study. So we performed a study to look at, do people with sort of high, moderate, and low caffeine consumption, do they benefit from caffeine supplementation similarly? And they did. They all did. So coming into this, I kind of had a hunch that these data wouldn't necessarily show anything different. I can't give you a particularly scientific reason for that, but sort of based upon our own previous data, I just felt like we probably show something similar.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned that this was a meta-analysis. What is a meta-analysis?
So the meta-analysis is kind of like a statistical analysis or model or study that combines the results of multiple scientific studies. So rather than us collecting data on new participants and analyze it all together in one study, we collated all the literature that existed up until the moment we performed it to determine what it currently suggests on that topic. And again, that's exactly why we wanted to do it. We wanted to know, what do the results from all these different studies suggest, rather than just churn out another one. Studies can lead to different results for a number of different reasons, of course. But once you start building up a large evidence base, and there is a large evidence base with caffeine, there's a lot of studies out there. I think a meta-analysis is a nice way of getting kind of a snapshot of the literature right now, and it can then generate sort of further questions. And essentially, we thought, if habitual consumption isn't as important as people think it is, or some people think it is, then those studies with low caffeine consumers would likely see greater performance benefits than those studies with high daily caffeine consumers.
Definitely. And how did you find the relevant studies then?
So we performed a literature search using 3 databases, I believe. And so using, standardized search terms, caffeine alongside exercise and performance and those kinds of things. Essentially, we wanted to be as broad as possible. We didn't want to miss out on a potential study, cover all the papers in the topic. But obviously, our search terms were specific enough as well, so that we didn't have to filter through, hundreds of thousands of articles just to, try to get one more.
Yeah. So did you have a criteria in mind then with regards to the people the participants of the studies, or the outcomes you were looking for?
Yeah. So we generally follow sort of the PICO recommendations, which goes population, intervention, control, and outcome. So our population, we accepted any study with healthy human men and women, any age. So they could be well-trained athletes, they could be just recreational people. The intervention, we needed to have at least 2 trials, sort of caffeine supplementation prior to an exercise task, or placebo supplementation prior to an exercise task. The control was sort of a placebo control, so sort of sits in the intervention as well. And then outcome, we needed the studies to have performed an exercise task as well. And so that was our initial search. That would give us sort of a snapshot of all the literature that's out there that's looked at caffeine in any kind of form prior to exercise. But then once we had all those studies, we then further refined it to those individual studies that quantified the habitual caffeine consumption of their participants, because our main aim here was to determine, does that habitual consumption affect the size of the effect of caffeine on performance.
Great. And then to get the information that you want, do you have to read through all of the studies, or how do you extract that data?
Well, luckily I have some good students who were willing to do a lot of that work. So, a shout out to the team who did that. Arthur, Gabrielle, Beatrice, and Felipe. So essentially, yeah. The first, after sort of getting all the first hits of following our searches, we need to filter the title and abstract to see if studies fit our criteria. Following that step, any that still remain, then the team have to go in and check, do these studies really fit our criteria, yes or no? And again, so that's a bit time consuming. And then the final step, once we've narrowed it down to, okay, we've got all our studies within our criteria, all of these have reported habitual caffeine consumption at some stage or within the paper. Now we have to extract from all these articles the relevant data that we want. And obviously, that's things like participant demographics, the outcome measures, what exercise tests were performed, all these kinds of things that are important.
Definitely. And then it says in the meta-analysis, when I was reading, you assess the quality of these studies. Why is that important to do?
I guess there's a lot of research out there, but I guess in another sense, not all research is equal, I would say. All studies have limitations, but some I think are more crucial than others. You need, in my opinion, you need to familiarize participants to the exercise protocol. Most people, have never performed a 30-second sprint on a bike in a lab before. So from day 1 to day 2, you'll probably have an improvement just because you've learned how to do the test. Have studies properly randomized, the order of the application of supplements, the placebo, caffeine, placebo, all these kind of little details that a study that can influence the credibility, the results of a study. So I think it's important to determine whether the evidence upon which we're basing our conclusions, are they solid? Have all these studies that have been included in this analysis done things the right way, the best way. Because if not, regardless of the results, maybe, our results aren't as powerful than if it's based upon limited studies or low quality studies.
Yeah, so it sounds like the meta-analysis tells us what direction, quantifies the direction of the results, and then the qualities, does that help us then determine what recommendations we can base on those results? Is that...
It's kind of like the certainty of evidence, isn't
Okay.
it? So how certain are we that these results that we've got now, are they, do we have high certainty that this is really what's happening? This is really what caffeine's doing. This is really what the effect of habitual intake is, or, is our certainty only moderate or low, or is it very low? Because, if after ranking the studies, you get to very low, it doesn't matter what the result is. If our results were the same, but the studies were judged as in general very low, well then, we can't have much certainty about our results anyway.
What did you find with the studies with regards to the quality?
So in general, our sort of certainty of evidence was moderate to high. So for most of the outcomes, so, we looked at a number of different outcomes, caffeine's effect in general, caffeine's effect within sort of men alone and women alone, caffeine's effect within sort of trained and untrained individuals. We did a lot of different kind of sub-analyses. And for the most part, we could consider sort of the certainty of our results moderate to high, which is fairly positive. So I think, the conclusions that we come to from this paper are fairly strong based upon that.
How many participants were there in
so if I remember correctly, there were just over 1,100 participants across the different studies. So that came from 60 different studies, I believe. So 60 different studies, over 1,100 participants, slightly under 1,000 of those being men, about 180 women. And then we also sort of classified individuals into trained, non-trained individuals. Interestingly, and quite positively, sort of most were considered sort of trained individuals, about 70%, and 30% non-trained individuals.
Why do we see such a skew towards so little women and so many men in these studies?
I think, unfortunately, that's a pretty common trend in sports science. It's something that's certainly being addressed with a lot of good researchers like Kirstie Elliott-Sale, Louise Burke, sort of highlighting this discrepancy. I think where it initially came from is that studies with women, with female athletes, were considered more difficult because of potential influences like the menstrual cycle. And so, unfortunately, people thought, oh, well, it's easier to get men in because their hormones are, chronically low, rather than getting sort of these female athletes in at the same time and having to work around these schedules, these cycles. And so I think, unfortunately, this crept into the arena and has kept on going on until recently. And I think now people are starting to realize, well, hey ho, you can't always likewise just extrapolate data in men out into women. So we need to start doing a better job of performing studies in women as well.
Great, that's hopeful if it's changing.
Yeah. It seems to be, but slow. I think it's still slow, but it seems to be going in the right direction.
Yeah. So what did you find? Did you find that we can have our coffee and drink it, or?
Well, I hope the title does suggest that, but yes. So yeah, the main finding from our meta-analysis is that caffeine works. Caffeine improves exercise performance. It's a small but significant effect. I think, as I said earlier, I think most supplements generally just have a small effect on performance, but that can make the difference. But most importantly here is that the size of this effect was not influenced by habitual caffeine consumption of the individuals. So, caffeine was effective regardless of, whether the individuals were high caffeine consumers, moderate caffeine consumers, low or naive. So I think in general, a win for the coffee drinkers, for the tea drinkers, for the caffeine drinkers.
Definitely. And was this impacted by type of exercise at all?
No. So we kind of performed some sub-analyses. We had enough outcomes to be able to, fairly robustly look into the different exercise types. So more kind of resistance exercise types we separated, anaerobic exercise types. So, those kind of explosive, very short duration, sprints that last only a few seconds to maybe a minute or two. And then those more endurance type exercises. So, from a few minutes to potentially, an hour or two, and so on. And so within each of those exercise types, again, caffeine showed similar performance benefits. And likewise, within those individual exercise types, habitual caffeine consumption had no effect. So all those people can have their coffee and they can drink it.
Brilliant. And what about the effect of sex? Did that have an impact either?
Again, similar results. So like we've just mentioned, predominantly in men, the studies, but results showed significant benefits for both men and women, and again with no influence of habitual intake. So a win for both sexes here.
Definitely. And do you think there was enough women? Because how many did you say? Was it 180 women roughly? Do you feel confident that we can extrapolate those results, given that there was a significant number of women?
It's a good question. I mean, obviously 180 is, if you were looking at it from the point of view of an individual study, 180, individuals would be, an enormous amount. And I think a lot of people would put quite a lot of faith in, so long as it was well controlled, well performed. But then I guess what our overall analysis didn't do was look at the individual details within the studies, how well they controlled for menstrual cycle, were they oral contraceptive users or not. So certainly, I think you could probably extrapolate with a little bit of caution. I think you probably likely see the same results in women, I think, than men, but maybe some, further well-controlled research is certainly warranted on the topic.
Yeah. I'm kind of jumping back here a little bit, but is it hard to control for habitual caffeine consumption? So do people know how much caffeine they're generally taking?
Well, that's the big question, I think. And that's the big, I think that's a big criticism that anybody could have of, I think, our paper here, any paper that tries to associate habitual caffeine consumption with performance, because as we said before, there's so much variation in, the amount that you're ingesting in a cup of coffee. And then, so not only is there variation in the actual sources, but then you're asking the individual generally via, a questionnaire or a food recall to quantify how much caffeine they ingest. And then we're quantifying that with a number. So, this person has 3 cups of coffee a day. So now we're saying that they ingest 210 milligrams of caffeine per day. But we know that number is hugely estimative. It could vary from day to day. Maybe on one day they're 210, on another they're 300, and so it varies wildly. So it's a really important factor to consider here, that while we do show, didn't show an effect or an influence of habitual caffeine consumption, there is the limitation that it's not likely to be 100% accurate, the quantification of habitual caffeine consumption. One thing I would say, though, to then sort of jump to the defense of our own study and research in the area, I think when you're starting to look at individuals who are caffeine naive, so who really are unlikely to have much caffeine in their diet, so they're reporting 1 or no cups of coffee per day or tea, etc. But then you have those other individuals on the other end of the scale, sort of the 5, 6, 7, 8 cups of coffee. You might not be able to accurately quantify in milligrams per day how much caffeine they're taking, but you can still say there's a huge disparity between these two. And even when kind of looking at, these caffeine naive and these, 5 to 6 to 8 cups of coffee a day, we still see the same kind of performance benefits when digging into the data. So, again, I think our data likely hold up, but it would be nice to see sort of good ways of quantifying habitual, or better ways of quantifying habitual caffeine consumption in the future.
So in your study, what did you find with regard to the dose? Do you have to consume a certain amount, or does it need to be comparable to your routine caffeine consumption?
So those were two things that we try to dig a little into. So in the literature, generally the recommendations are 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body mass. So we generally provide in studies doses relative to the individual. And so we kind of separated out those studies that had less than 3 milligrams per kilo, 3 to 6, and above 6. And when looking at that kind of lower than 3 milligrams per kilo and 3 to 6, the performance benefits were there, and they seemed sort of comparable between the two. However, above 6 milligrams per kilo, it seemed like we showed no significant benefit on exercise performance. A caveat on that is that there were very few studies with the higher doses, but this is what other studies have shown as well, that higher doses of caffeine, although some individual studies show benefits, a lot don't, and a lot show potentially greater side effects with caffeine. You might get greater headaches, nausea, jitters, all these kinds of negative side effects that you see when you get to the higher end of the caffeine scale. So certainly our data support kind of 3 to 6 milligrams per kilo, and potentially suggest that less is also good, is also beneficial to performance. And then linking that into relative to the habitual dose then, I think that's an interesting one, because these data suggest that the pre-exercise dose doesn't have to exceed your daily habitual dose. But that's something that's kind of been debated or speculated in the literature a little bit, that there's some studies that have shown that habituation occurs when you provide the individuals with caffeine for 28 days. But in these studies, the amount taken per day was the same as the pre-exercise amount. So, 3 milligrams per day, 28 days, and then you provide 3 milligrams per kilo prior to exercise. People speculate that if we simply increase that pre-exercise dose, well, then we won't lose any effect, because you're just going above that habitual intake, and then so then you'll get your ergogenic benefit. Again, our data suggests that this might not be necessary. So, in my opinion, I think you can just keep on, choosing your favorite dose until I think we can provide more more specific recommendations.
Right, and in that way you can reduce the side effects or minimize your chance of the side effects.
In a way, I guess I think the side effects are slightly individual as well. You'll have somebody who takes 6 milligrams per kilo and they feel nothing, and you'll have somebody who takes 2 milligrams per kilo and they really feel it and they're up all night. So I think certainly the lower the dose that you can take, and if you're getting a performance benefit from lower doses, then stick with that, because you will avoid the side effects that generally creep in more and more the larger the dose you take. Generally, I would say try not to exceed 6 milligrams per kilo.
Could you experience those side effects and the performance enhancing effects simultaneously? Or is it, if you're experiencing those side effects, is that an indication that you've taken too much?
I would say more anecdotally rather than sort of based on studies. But from what I've seen in our own lab here, I would say that it doesn't necessarily translate into a worsened performance. But likewise, I've never seen sort of side effects that are sort of really bad. People feel it. Sometimes, they are getting really jittery. They're getting really chatting. Not all the side effects, I would say, in a way, are necessarily bad. Because you can just tell people are so agitated, raring to go. They can't stop moving, jittery. Is that negative for performance? Probably not. But then there's the other side of the side effects where, some people get anxiety, some people get headaches. So that side of it might then sort of not be beneficial to performance. So I think it really is slightly variable, but for sure, I do think that with moderate side effects, you could still get the benefits. And I mean, elite athletes are so used to sort of pushing through pain barriers and things like that. So these are probably the least of their worries. Their legs are probably aching. That's what they're thinking about, not the slight sort of jitters that they've got.
Yeah, definitely. And was there an effect of training status?
Likewise, no. So caffeine beneficial for both sides, which is obviously good. I mean, does that mean that sort of non-trained individuals should be taking caffeine? If they want to, I guess they can. But I think the more important detail here is that those athletes who sort of are looking for those minute performance benefits to potentially be the difference between winning or not winning, I think they'll benefit.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that you were interested in this question because there's known individual differences in response to caffeine. What are you interested in next? If this isn't why we see individual differences, what do you think is causing those?
Again, I don't think our analysis here necessarily shuts the door. It gives us a nice overview of, okay, the literature's used low users, high users, moderate users, and it doesn't seem to moderate. So maybe the effect isn't that important. But I still think a few well-controlled studies can really give us more definitive answers. And that's exactly what we're trying to do in our group. So we're trying to, with a couple of different study designs, trying to figure out sort of really, is habitual caffeine consumption that important for the ergogenic effect of pre-exercise caffeine? And we're also sort of using a model to see, can we induce a tolerance? And again, if we kind of, modify the dose following a level of tolerance, does this, can we overcome any potential tolerance? Although I'm not sure if we'll actually see a tolerance to the caffeine or not.
Okay. And what is the current status then for evidence of other reasons we might see individual differences?
In my opinion, just as the literature is just as shaky, I would say, in a way. You've got the big one right now is CYP1A2, so the genetic differences in caffeine metabolism. So we have the supposed fast metabolizers, intermediate metabolizers, and slow metabolizers of caffeine. And so there's a few studies now suggesting that maybe those individuals who have slower caffeine metabolism benefit less or don't benefit from caffeine, with one or two studies potentially suggesting that the super slow metabolizers actually sort of have a worsening of performance with caffeine. So, if that's the case, these people should, strictly avoid caffeine. If you don't have a benefit, but you're not getting worse, it's almost like, well, you tried okay, but if you're actively getting worse, you don't want that. But again, it's based upon sort of only a couple of studies with certain limitations. So that, again, is something that we're looking into, but we need to, I think, as a scientific community, try to get to the bottom of, because, I have seen people promoting the importance of, knowing your genotype for caffeine metabolism to benefit, but we simply don't know. We think it's one factor. It might be, it might not be, potentially, all these things might build up. Maybe, habitual consumption combined with genetics for caffeine metabolism combined with another factor. Maybe all that could generate sort of effects. But I think right now those are the two big ones that are being debated: habitual consumption and caffeine metabolism. And unfortunately, I think, in my opinion, we don't have robust answers.
Yeah. So what would your recommendations then be for people who aren't sure whether they're someone who might be negatively impacted? What do we do from here then?
Test it in training, I think, is the big one. The big one should be test it in training, and if you can, try to sort of test it under kind of fairly controlled conditions. In a lab, it's easier to detect differences because we're asking people to come in at the same time of day. We're standardizing the environment. We're asking people to replicate their diet, and people generally don't do that in their training. But if people could just, cyclists, for example, they use like an FTP, 20-minute functional threshold power, 20-minute, 30-minute test. If you're doing that on occasion, do that with caffeine, without caffeine, to see how it's influencing you, and go from there. I think, how do you feel? Do you have side effects? Do you not have side effects? Do you feel you're getting better? Are your numbers showing you're getting better? And go from there. I think trying and testing in training is the best way forward, really. But just a note on that, likewise, the very slow metabolizers only form a small part of the population, generally about 10%. So the likelihood of somebody being slow metabolizer is up in the air. And likewise, I'm not 100% convinced by these data right now. I think at worst, these individuals won't have a benefit. But I think the data showing that it might be negative for them is not the strongest right now.
Yeah. So there's a general consensus that caffeine is one of few supplements that has strong evidence.
Yeah, right. Certainly. Okay. I think 4 years ago now, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, came out with a consensus statement saying, there's 5 supplements with good to strong evidence that they could work in certain situations, and caffeine was one of them. So, there's over 250 studies in the literature showing that caffeine is pretty effective.
Okay. How long before an event would you recommend consuming caffeine?
I think it depends a little bit on the form. So when we're looking at, say, in capsules or in drinks, then half an hour to an hour before the event. Depends a little bit on the length of the event as well, but what we see capture in tablet form, capsule form, caffeine peaks in the blood about 1 hour post ingestion. So if the event's only sort of 1 to 2 hours or less than that, then I think sort of supplementing 1 hour before should be perfect. Caffeine in chewing gum is released quicker because there's oral absorption. So you could potentially benefit from caffeine after only 15 minutes compared to sort of the standard 60 with usual ingestion. So that's maybe just another interesting alternative form. But I think it depends a little bit as well. Endurance individuals might want to take sort of caffeine at a lower dose at a few sort of moments throughout their race rather than sort of everything pre-exercise. So
yeah,
sometimes you just have to think a little bit and tweak a little bit.
definitely. So looking at this study specifically again, in summary, what does it tell us and what doesn't it tell us?
Difficult one. So what it does tell us is that I think the habitual caffeine consumption of individuals probably isn't as important as we think it is in terms of the ergogenic effects of pre-exercise caffeine. If you're a high caffeine consumer on a daily basis because you're drinking a few coffees, if you're a low caffeine drinker, consumer, you're likely to get a benefit in your exercise if you take caffeine prior to exercise. I think that's the most important thing to take away from this study. What it doesn't tell us is that this is the absolute truth for absolutely everybody, and will always be the truth. Potentially, we might follow this up with individual studies determining there is some variation, and this type of individual might not benefit or might want to reduce their caffeine intake, and this individual caffeine intake it doesn't matter. But for now, I think these are the best recommendations, are that it probably don't have to worry about it, and best to test caffeine during training anyway.
Sounds like good news.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. What's next then for you personally?
For me personally, we've got a hell of a lot of other different studies going on regarding supplementation and exercise performance. Some of the things that I said about caffeine, we've got ongoing here. I got a group of really fantastic and keen students who lead some fantastic projects. What I'm loving right now is sort of looking at supplements like beta-alanine, sodium bicarb, nitrates, and caffeine, and sort of looking at what factors can modify the effects. We kind of know they work, but can we optimize their effect in a way? Or like this, should certain people be avoiding it for some reason or not? So hopefully you'll be seeing a few more bits of work from our group over the next few years in this kind of area.
Where can we keep an eye on your work?
I suppose people could take a look on ResearchGate, where sort of most of my published articles are there, and then I'm kind of active on Twitter when I wish to be. So I think my name on Twitter is @bicycle_Bryan. That's Bryan with a Y. So yeah, those are probably the two best places to maybe sort of where I kind of throw out things from our group.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Bryan. It's been a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks. I hope some of the information was the rambled information was useful for your listeners.
It
Cheers.
was, yeah, very interesting. Thanks.